There is something profoundly sacred about the spaces we dedicate to prayer, worship, and reflection. These are the places where the soul seeks communion with the divine, where silence speaks louder than words, and where our hearts are truly open to the presence of God. In such places, we often experience a sense of awe, reverence, and a deeper connection to something greater than ourselves. But in today's world, where we are constantly surrounded by distractions and the urge to capture every moment through a lens, we may begin to ask ourselves, does a photograph of this sacred space truly honor its sanctity, or does it diminish the deep, personal encounter we are called to experience? In these sacred spaces, we are invited not to look outward, but inward, to quiet our thoughts, to silence the noise around us, and to focus entirely on the divine presence that resides within. The temptation to record every moment through a camera can sometimes lead us to forget the true essence of what we are experiencing. When we take a photo, we might inadvertently shift our attention from the holiness of the moment to the desire for an external validation, a snapshot that might one day remind us of where we've been. But in doing so, it could also distance us from what we're actually meant to be doing, encountering the divine with our hearts, not our smartphones. Saint Francis of Assisi, a man of deep contemplation and simplicity, once experienced a profound encounter with the sacred that is a powerful reminder for us today. On one occasion, as he entered a church for prayer, he noticed the distractions that many people faced, even in a place meant for complete devotion. As he observed this, he became deeply moved, and he chose to speak out against the use of worldly distractions in holy spaces, including the taking of photographs. He believed that the sacred was meant to be experienced in the heart, not through external forms of validation or representation. His words, spoken centuries ago, still resonate today. Let the world be silent, and let the soul speak its prayer. In his life, St. Francis showed us the true connection with God happens in silence, in the act of being still before Him, in the absence of anything that might pull our hearts away. When we approach sacred spaces with the intent to capture an image, we risk losing that silent communion. A picture, no matter how beautiful or meaningful, cannot replace the depth of the encounter that takes place when we are fully present in the moment before the divine. Reflect on this. How often do we find ourselves distracted by the idea of preserving a moment for later, rather than immersing ourselves fully in the experience itself? When was the last time you entered a church or a sacred space and allowed your heart to remain undistracted, focused solely on God, without feeling the need to document it? These are questions that invite us to reflect on the true purpose of our spiritual encounters.
It is often said that the most sacred moments are those we cannot capture in a photograph. Think of a moment of prayer where, for just a brief second, the veil between the divine and the human is lifted, and we experience a deep, personal connection. These moments are fleeting, but they are also the most precious. They remind us that the act of truly seeing, of witnessing the sacred, requires something much deeper than the eyes. It demands the attention of the heart. As you enter any sacred space, pause for a moment. Close your eyes, quiet your mind. Before taking any step, offer a prayer of reverence, asking God to help you focus on His presence. Lord, I come before you not seeking the validation of the world, but the quiet stillness of your Spirit. Help me to be fully present here, not with my camera or my thoughts of the outside world, but with my heart, open to your presence. This prayer is an invitation to silence the distractions and to enter into a deeper, more intimate experience of God. And here, at the threshold of sacred space, ask yourself, why do I feel the need to capture this moment? Is it to relive the experience, or is it to be so immersed in the moment that I am lost in it? What if the most sacred thing I could do is to simply be still, without the desire to photograph or record, and let my heart speak to God in silence? As you reflect on these questions, remember that the true purpose of a sacred space is to foster a direct and unbroken connection with God. The taking of photographs, while not inherently wrong, can sometimes serve as a distraction from the deeper calling to experience that space as a place of communion, of transformation, and of prayer. This is the challenge we face in a world that constantly urges us to capture every moment for later viewing. But sometimes the most holy act is simply to be still, in full silence and devotion. If you feel compelled to share your experience, let it be in the way you live, in the way your actions reflect the peace and grace you have encountered in that sacred space. For, as the Apostle Paul reminds us in his letter to the Corinthians, so whether you eat or drink or whatever you do, do it all for the glory of God. Your experience in a sacred space is meant to glorify God, not to be turned into a commodity to be shared with others, but rather to be deeply internalized, transforming your heart and soul. In the silence of that space, you may find that God's presence becomes clearer, more tangible, and more real than any photograph could ever convey. And now, as you prepare to enter into such sacred moments, remember to leave behind the distractions of the world. Let your soul be still, and in that stillness, may you truly meet God. There is a profound truth about the spaces where we come to worship and pray, a truth that goes beyond the architecture or even the people present.
Sacred spaces are not simply physical places, they're portals to the divine, where our souls meet God in ways that words cannot fully express. Yet in our modern world, where every experience seems to demand validation through photographs and social media, we are called to remember the deeper purpose of these spaces. The act of taking a photo in such a place, though seemingly innocent, can often distract us from the very presence we seek. To truly understand why photography can detract from the sacred, let us first consider the significance of silence in a spiritual life. Silence is not merely the absence of sound, but the quieting of the heart and mind. In silence, we are able to hear God in ways that are not possible when we are preoccupied with the world around us. Consider the story of Saint Benedict, whose monastic rule emphasized silence as a pathway to spiritual clarity. In his rule, he instructed his monks to embrace silence as a means of fostering humility and attentiveness to God's presence. Silence for Benedict was not simply a lack of noise, it was a profound openness to God's voice, a space where the soul could breathe and be nourished. Saint Benedict's life offers us a model for how we might approach sacred spaces today. When we enter a church or temple, we are entering a space specifically designed for spiritual communion. This space is set apart, not only by its physical structure, but by its ability to draw us away from the distractions of daily life. And yet, how often do we enter such spaces only to be distracted by our own thoughts or by the desire to capture the moment through our phone or camera? In doing so, we risk missing the very reason we are there: to be in the presence of God, to listen, to receive His peace. As we reflect on this, it is helpful to consider the words of the psalmist, "Be still and know that I am God." Here the invitation is clear. God is present, but we must be still in order to truly experience His presence. How often do we think we are seeing something sacred, when in fact, our minds are already planning how to share it with others? A photograph, while it may capture a moment, can never encapsulate the depth of spiritual communion that occurs in a sacred space. In that sacred stillness,
God speaks directly to the soul, inviting us into a deeper relationship with Him. But if we are too caught up in capturing the moment, we miss the invitation. Think of the times you've entered a church or temple with a specific intent, perhaps for prayer, perhaps to seek solace or understanding. In those moments, your heart is often open, your mind focused, and your spirit receptive. But when we allow ourselves to be distracted by the act of photographing, we divert our attention away from the very thing we sought, God's presence. We might leave with a photo, but did we truly experience the peace and grace that we came seeking?
Saint Teresa of Avila, one of the great mystics of the Church, understood this deeply. In her writings, she spoke of the importance of interior silence, especially in moments of prayer. For Teresa, prayer was not simply about the words we speak to God, but about creating a space within our hearts where we can truly listen to Him. Mental prayer, she said, is the most important of all, for it is the prayer of the heart, the prayer where God speaks to us in the deepest part of our being. This interior silence is what allows us to experience God not as a distant idea, but as a living presence. And it is precisely in such moments, when our hearts are attuned to God, that the sacred becomes real. As you consider these reflections, take a moment to ask yourself, what do I truly seek when I enter a sacred space? Is it the beauty of the architecture, the history of the place, or the possibility of capturing a meaningful image? Or is it something deeper, the desire to encounter God, to be drawn closer to Him in a way that cannot be captured by any camera? One of the most powerful practices we can adopt when entering sacred spaces is to first silence our hearts and minds. Before we take a single step, before we even look at the surroundings, let us offer a simple prayer of surrender. Lord, I come before you, not with the desire to capture this moment for the world to see, but with the intention to experience you. Help me to be fully present here, without distractions, that I might know your peace. In doing so, we align our hearts with the deeper purpose of our visit. This practice can be transformative, for it shifts the focus from external validation to an internal transformation. In silence, we are able to hear God's voice more clearly. We begin to see with new eyes that are not distracted by the fleeting nature of external things, but that are fixed solely on God. And in that gaze, we find peace, healing, and grace. As you ponder these thoughts, consider also the words of Jesus in the Gospel of Matthew. But when you pray, go into your room, close the door, and pray to your Father, who is unseen. Then your Father, who sees what is done in secret, will reward you. Matthew 6:6. Here, Jesus teaches us that true prayer happens in the quiet of our hearts, away from the need for recognition or external validation. The sacred is not something to be shown off, but something to be experienced intimately with God. In this way, the sacred space is a place of profound transformation. It is a place where we can set aside our worldly concerns and focus solely on God's presence. And in this space, we are invited to become more fully who we were meant to be, people who, like Saint Benedict and Saint Teresa, find God in the silence and stillness of our hearts. So as you enter sacred spaces, may you remember the true purpose of your visit. May you silence the distractions of the world, and may your heart be fully present to God.
In doing so, you will find that the experience is far more profound and lasting than any photograph could ever be, and you will leave that space not just with a memory, but with a heart that has been touched by the divine. The act of entering a sacred space is an invitation, a call to stillness, reflection, and a deeper union with God. When we step into such a space, we are not merely walking through a physical threshold. We are stepping into a moment where the divine becomes present in a unique and powerful way. The walls may be adorned with beauty. The air may be filled with a sacred silence. But it is not the place itself that holds the power. It is God's presence that transforms it. Yet, how often do we forget this in our busy lives, caught up in the desire to capture that moment for later, as if the experience itself could be reduced to a picture or a memento? Let us take a moment to reflect on the life of Saint Augustine, a man who was profoundly moved by the beauty of sacred spaces, but who also recognized the importance of a heart focused on God rather than on the outward display of those spaces. In his Confessions, he recounts how, during his conversion, he entered a church and was struck not by the physical structure, but by the stillness that filled it. It was not the architecture that touched him, but the quiet, the space where he could turn his thoughts inward and encounter God. He writes, "I entered into my own depths, and there I found you, O God, with me." This powerful insight reflects what we are called to experience in every sacred space we enter. Not an external focus, but an internal transformation. St. Augustine's encounter with God in silence teaches us that the sacred is not something to be captured with our cameras, but something to be encountered with our hearts. This truth brings us to a crucial question. What do we seek when we enter a sacred space? Is it to take a photograph to show others what we have experienced? Or is it to encounter God, to open our hearts to His presence, and to listen for His voice? So often the temptation is to document our surroundings, to preserve the moment for later viewing, but this is where we risk missing the heart of the encounter. True spiritual experience cannot be captured by a camera. It is only felt, lived, and experienced in the depth of our hearts. When we enter sacred spaces, we must remind ourselves to leave behind the distractions of the world, including the urge to capture the moment for others. Instead, we should focus on what truly matters, the intimate connection with God that can only be experienced in silence and stillness.
Jesus encourages us to enter into the secret place of prayer, where we are alone with God and the distractions of the world are set aside. The sacred space, whether it is a church, a temple, or a quiet room, becomes holy not because of its external appearance, but because of the encounter that takes place within it. To capture that moment with a camera, to seek validation from others, is to forget the deeper truth that God sees us in secret, in the silence of our hearts. This is where the true encounter happens, away from the external distractions, in the quiet place where we meet God on a deeply personal level. This brings us to a practice that can help us maintain focus in sacred spaces, the prayer of surrender. Before entering a church, temple, or other holy place, we can take a moment to center ourselves and offer a simple prayer. Lord, I come before you in silence. Help me to be fully present in this moment, not distracted by the world or by my own desires. Open my heart to your presence, that I may encounter you in the deepest way. This prayer is not a mere formality. It is an invitation to God to open our hearts and minds, to clear away the distractions, and to help us enter into a space of reverence and quiet communion. St. Ignatius of Loyola, the founder of the Jesuits, often spoke of the importance of discernment, the ability to listen attentively to God's voice in our lives. He taught that discernment is not just about making decisions, but about being deeply aware of God's presence in every moment, especially in sacred spaces. For Ignatius, prayer was not just about speaking to God, it was about listening and receiving God's guidance. If we approach sacred spaces with the same attitude of discernment, we will find that God speaks to us in ways that go beyond our immediate understanding. As we reflect on these truths, we may find ourselves asking, how can we better prepare ourselves to encounter God in sacred spaces? How can we open our hearts fully to His presence without the distractions that so often pull us away? The answer lies in the practice of conscious presence, being fully aware and intentional as we enter these spaces. Let us take a moment to breathe deeply, to quiet the mind, and to surrender our desires for external validation. Let us enter with a heart ready to listen, to experience, and to be transformed by God's love. Remember the words of St. Francis of Assisi, who, in his simple life, found God in the quiet of nature and in the stillness of prayer. He once said, "We have been called to heal wounds, to unite what has fallen apart, and to bring home those who have lost their way." This healing begins in the silence of our hearts, in the sacred spaces where we encounter God. When we allow ourselves to be fully present in those moments, we become vessels of His peace and love in the world.
So as you enter any sacred space, take a moment to offer a prayer of surrender, to quiet your heart, and to focus on God's presence. Leave behind the distractions of the world and the urge to capture the moment. Instead, focus on the deeper truth that the sacred is not something to be photographed, but something to be lived, felt, and experienced in the stillness of our hearts. In that stillness, you will find the true encounter with God that you seek. In the sacred space, our hearts are meant to be attuned to the presence of the divine. We step through the doors not simply to observe, but to enter into a relationship, a communion that transcends the material and touches the eternal. However, in this digital age, we often find ourselves facing a temptation that distracts us from this deeper connection. The desire to capture the moment through a lens, to photograph the sacred in an effort to hold on to it. But can we truly capture the sacred with a camera? Or is the essence of what we seek beyond our ability to frame it in a picture? Let us begin by reflecting on the words of Jesus, who in the Gospel of John reminds us God is spirit, and His worshipers must worship in the spirit and in truth, John 4:24. This call to worship in the Spirit speaks directly to the heart of why sacred spaces are so powerful. They are not simply places of aesthetic beauty. They are spiritual portals where our hearts are invited into an intimate communion with God. In this space, the material world fades away, and the only reality that matters is God's presence. To try to capture this with a photograph is to attempt to reduce the boundless, infinite God to something small, something we can control or possess. It misses the point. The sacred cannot be contained by our human attempts to preserve it. It is meant to be experienced in the moment, in the stillness of our hearts. Consider the story of St. John of the Cross, the Spanish mystic and poet, whose life was marked by an intense search for God in the silence and solitude of prayer. He lived at a time when the external world was filled with distractions, and yet he sought only the presence of God. In his writings, he speaks of the dark night of the soul, a period of spiritual dryness where the soul seems to be abandoned by God. But even in that darkness, St. John found a deeper connection with God. He realized that true worship, true encounter, does not depend on the visible or the tangible, but on the inner surrender of the heart to God's presence. He writes, "In the dark night of the soul, there is stillness, and in that stillness, God speaks." His life and teachings remind us that the sacred is not something we can own or control. It is something that calls us to silence, to listen, and to trust in the unseen. As we enter sacred spaces, we must ask ourselves, what is it that we seek? Are we looking for something to hold on to, something to prove we were there?
Or are we seeking God, whose presence transcends any image or photograph we could take? This question is not just about what we do in the moment, but about how we approach the sacred with our hearts. When we step into a place of worship, we are not just walking into a building, we are walking into a space where time and eternity meet, where the visible and invisible collide. To capture that moment in a photograph is to miss the invitation to truly be present, to surrender our desires and simply be with God. This idea is further illuminated by the teachings of Saint Thérèse of Lisieux, who understood that it is not in the grand gestures that we encounter God, but in the small, simple acts of devotion. She writes in her autobiography, "I have always been convinced that to live in love means to forget oneself and live solely for God." Saint Therese's little way of spirituality emphasizes that the most profound moments of grace often come in quiet surrender, in acts of humble love that are unseen by others. In this same way, sacred spaces are not places to be shown off or documented, but places to encounter God in the quiet of our hearts. It is in the silence, in the stillness, that we encounter God most fully, and it is only in that space that we can truly understand the depth of His love. If we are to approach sacred spaces with the reverence they deserve, we must first prepare our hearts to be fully present. As we enter, we should pause for a moment and offer a prayer of surrender. Lord, I come before you in this sacred space. Help me to lay aside all distractions, all desires for recognition, and to simply be present with you. May this space become a holy ground where I encounter you in silence, in stillness, and in truth. This prayer is not just a formality, it is an invitation to allow the sacred to permeate our hearts and minds, to be fully attuned to God's presence in that moment. When we are fully present, when we leave behind the need to capture or document, we allow God to move in ways that go beyond our understanding. The act of taking a photograph in a sacred space can sometimes be an attempt to grasp the ineffable, to hold on to something that cannot be contained. Yet as we see in the teachings of the saints, the most profound experiences of the divine cannot be captured by our human hands. They are meant to be experienced in the depths of our hearts. The sacred is not something we can own, it is something that we receive. In the stillness, God speaks. In the silence, we encounter His love. And it is in this encounter that we are transformed. Let us also consider the words of the Apostle Paul in his letter to the Corinthians. So whether you eat or drink or whatever you do, do it all for the glory of God. This passage speaks to the essence of our relationship with the divine. Everything we do, even the smallest acts, should be done for God's glory. The act of entering a sacred space is no exception.
It is not about seeking external recognition or validation. It is about offering ourselves fully to God, in the silence, in the stillness, and in the reverence of that moment. In this way, sacred spaces become not just places of prayer, but places where we are invited to encounter the divine in a deeper, more intimate way. As you reflect on these teachings, take a moment to ask yourself, what do I seek in sacred spaces? Am I seeking God, or am I seeking something to capture, something to prove that I was there? Let this question guide you as you enter any place of worship, and let it remind you to be fully present, to surrender your distractions, and to seek God above all else. In that space, in that stillness, you will encounter the divine in ways that go far beyond what any photograph could capture. And it is in that encounter that you will find the true peace and grace that your soul longs for. As we come to the end of our reflections on sacred spaces and the temptation to capture them with photographs,
it is important to take a moment to remember the ultimate purpose of our encounters with the divine. Sacred spaces are not simply places we visit. They are places where God's presence is experienced, not through the lens of a camera, but through the eyes of the heart. The deeper truth of these spaces lies in the silence they invite, the stillness that allows our souls to be transformed. In this final reflection, we are reminded that the sacred cannot be contained by any earthly means, and our relationship with God in these spaces should be one of awe, reverence, and surrender. Let us reflect on the story of Saint Catherine of Siena, a woman who, in her deep communion with God, understood the true nature of sacred spaces. She lived in a time of great turmoil, but she found solace in the quiet, in the places where she could hear God's voice in her heart. Saint Catherine would often retreat to her room in solitude, where she would pray and meditate on God's love. One of her most profound teachings was the importance of surrendering to God's will, and she recognized that it was in the stillness of prayer, in the sacred space of her own heart, that she was able to encounter God in the deepest way. She once wrote, "If you are what you should be, you will set the whole world on fire." Her words remind us that the sacred is not just a place to visit, but a way of being, a way of aligning ourselves with God's presence in every moment, in every space.
The beauty of sacred spaces lies not in the image we might create of them, but in the stillness and the peace they offer when we approach them with reverence and devotion. It is this sacred encounter that truly transforms us. And yet, in our modern world, the temptation to capture the sacred is often overwhelming. We live in a society where every moment is shared, every experience is documented, and every visit to a holy place is an opportunity to show others that we were there. But as we reflect on the lives of saints like Saint Catherine, we realize that this desire for external validation cannot compare to the deeper joy that comes from being fully present to God. To seek the approval of others through photographs is to miss the point of the sacred encounter, which is to surrender our hearts, to listen for God's voice, and to allow His presence to shape us. St. Augustine, too, speaks of this inner transformation that occurs when we open ourselves to God's presence. In his Confessions, he recounts his own struggles with distractions and his longing for peace. He writes, "You have made us for yourself, O Lord, and our heart is restless until it rests in you." This restlessness is something many of us feel when we enter sacred spaces. But it is not a restlessness caused by the space itself. It is the longing of the soul to be fully united with God. The sacred space is the place where this union happens, not through external things, but through the opening of our hearts to God's presence. It is in this stillness that we find the peace we seek, a peace that cannot be captured or preserved, but only experienced. In these sacred spaces, we are called not to focus on the external or the material, but to turn our attention inward, to the depths of our soul. As the psalmist reminds us, "Be still and know that I am God," Psalm 46:10. In the stillness of sacred spaces, we are called to experience the presence of God, not as a distant observer, but as one who is deeply engaged with the divine. This is the essence of true worship, to be fully present, to offer ourselves in surrender, and to allow God to speak to us in the silence of our hearts. It is also important to recognize that this encounter with God in sacred spaces is not a passive experience, but an active one. It requires our participation, our willingness to be open to God's transformative power. As we enter sacred spaces,
We are invited to let go of our distractions and our need for external validation. We are invited to be fully present, to listen, and to receive God's love in a way that changes us from the inside out. A powerful way to prepare for such an encounter is through prayer. Before entering any sacred space, take a moment to offer a prayer of surrender. Lord, I come before you in this sacred space. I lay aside my distractions and my need to capture this moment for others.
Help me to be fully present with you, to listen for your voice, and to receive the peace that only you can give. This prayer of surrender is not just a ritual. It is an invitation to align our hearts with God's will, to open ourselves to His transformative presence, and to experience the sacred space as a place where we encounter His love in the deepest way. In closing, let us remember the words of Saint Teresa of Avila. Christ has no body now on earth but yours, no hands but yours, no feet but yours. The sacred space is not just a place we visit. It is a place where we encounter God's presence, where we are called to be transformed, and where we are invited to live out His love in the world. This transformation does not happen through photographs or external representations, but through the surrender of our hearts and our willingness to be fully present with God. As we enter these sacred spaces, let us leave behind the distractions of the world and enter with hearts open to the divine, ready to experience the peace and grace that only God can give. May we come to understand that the sacred is not something to be captured or owned, but something to be lived, to be experienced in the silence and stillness of our hearts. May our time in these spaces transform us, so that we might go out into the world carrying the love and peace of God with us in every moment, in every place.